Usually when we talk about freedom in the modern world, there is this deeply ingrained expectation that it just means the complete and total absence of rules.
Right, yeah, like absolute autonomy.
Exactly. I mean, we picture open roads, no speed limits, no boss looking over your shoulder, just no societal expectations weighing you down at all.
It is the ultimate contemporary ideal, really.
Yeah. You break out of whatever cage you're currently in, the door swings wide open, and you just get to step out and define yourself, entirely on your own terms.
We basically view unconstrained autonomy as the highest possible good a human being can achieve.
We really do. But then you step into the historical and theological world of the Exodus.
Oh, man. Yeah?
Right, the ancient biblical story of the Israelites escaping slavery in Egypt, and suddenly that whole modern definition of freedom just completely falls apart.
It shatters. I mean, it doesn't even compute in that world.
Not at all.
Yeah.
We're looking at a landscape where true freedom isn't the absence of boundaries. Rather, it's about being brought into the right relationship.
Right, which is so counterintuitive to us.
It really is. I mean, it suggests that, a fish isn't free when you take it out of the restrictive boundaries of the fishbowl and just put it on the kitchen counter.
Yeah, that fish is just going to die.
Exactly. It's only free when it is constrained by the environment it was actually designed for.
That right there is the absolute definition of a paradigm shift. I mean, we are so socially conditioned to think of rules as the polar opposite of freedom.
Yeah, they're the enemy of freedom.
Right. But in the context of ancient theology, and specifically the Sinai narrative we're looking at today, the rules are the very architecture that makes freedom survivable for a newly liberated people.
Okay, let's unpack this, because we are digging into a really fascinating stack of sources today.
We really are. There's a lot here.
So much. It's anchored by this really comprehensive document by Chris R. Velasquez. It's titled Covenant at Sinai.
Right, and it comes with those incredibly detailed visual frameworks, too.
Yes, those frameworks are amazing. They map out this entire historical and theological timeline of the Sinai event. And, well, the mission for this deep dive is to completely reframe how you look at the Exodus story.
Because it really needs reframing.
It does, because, if you are anything like me, when you think of the Exodus, you think of the cinematic climax.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
The Charlton Heston moment?
Yes. You picture the plagues, the dramatic parting of the Red Sea, the Egyptian chariots getting washed away,
Right.
and then, roll credits.
Right. The people are free. Story over.
Exactly. That's how almost every Hollywood adaptation treats the narrative. The escape from oppression is treated as the finale.
But the author makes such a striking argument here. He says that stopping at the Red Sea just misses the entire architectural purpose of the story.
Yeah, the true climax doesn't actually happen at the sea.
No, it happens weeks later.
Weeks later at this terrifying desert mountain called Sinai. So the core premise of our source here is that in the biblical narrative, redemption is never, ever merely escape.
Right. God didn't bring the Israelites out of Egypt just so they could wander the desert and, drift into some vague, individualized self-definition.
Like a desert Burning Man festival or something.
Exactly. He didn't just want them to not be slaves anymore. He rescued them specifically to bind them to himself.
Which is such a huge distinction. Deliverance is merely the prelude. The covenant is the actual goal.
Yeah, at the Red Sea, the text shows God saving his people from Pharaoh's jurisdiction. But at Sinai, he actually shapes them for his own jurisdiction.
Wow, yeah, from one jurisdiction to another.
And it addresses something deeply ingrained in human psychology, I think. We all instinctively appreciate deliverance while simultaneously resisting discipleship.
Oh, that is so true. We want the release from oppression, right? Or financial ruin or physical pain.
We desperately want the rescue. But we do not necessarily want the yoke of someone else's lordship or authority once we are safe.
Right. I mean, we want to be carried out of the burning building, but we absolutely do not want the firefighter telling us what we are allowed to eat for breakfast once we are safely on the sidewalk.
That is a perfect way to put it. But Sinai confronts that human impulse head on.
It really does. The exact same God who says, I am the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, is the one who immediately follows it up with, you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation.
He removes Pharaoh's tyrannical rule, sure, but he doesn't leave a vacuum.
No. He replaces it with his own sovereign rule.
And to really understand the mechanics of how that new rule operates, we have to look closely at the historical sequence. specifically how this covenant was established in Exodus chapter 19.
Yeah, let's look at chapter 19, because the order of events completely dismantles our usual assumptions about how religion works.
Oh, totally. Both ancient religions and, frankly, modern ones too.
Right. So if you look at the progression, the covenant begins with this really astonishing statement of historical grace.
Before God gives a single command.
Yes. Before there is any list of moral requirements, he reminds Israel of his prior mercy. The source quotes it. You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself.
I bore you on eagle's wings.
It's just such a tender, fiercely protective image to use in the middle of a harsh desert.
It really is.
Yeah.
And the chronology here is the most important part of the text, I think. Divine initiative precedes human response.
Deliverance precedes duty.
The theological weight of that sequence just cannot be overstated. I mean, almost every other ancient religious system, the gods demand performance before they offer protection.
Right, it's like a transaction.
Exactly. The gods say, here are the rules, bring me these specific sacrifices, and if you keep them perfectly, I might come down and save you from your enemies.
Which is basically salvation by works.
Yeah. But the Sinai sequence flips that entirely. The statement is essentially, I have already saved you.
I already destroyed your oppressors. I carried you out of slavery, and you didn't even have to lift a finger.
Now, because of that accomplished fact, here is how we are going to live together.
You know, it's like the difference between a job interview and a marriage.
Oh, that's an analogy.
Like, in a job interview, you have to perform to get the position right. You bring your resume, you prove your worth, and if you do well enough, they grant you the job.
You earn it.
Exactly. But in a healthy marriage, you don't perform chores for a stranger to convince them to marry you.
Right. You don't sneak into someone's house and start doing their laundry and say, look, I'm doing your laundry, therefore we are married.
Yeah, that would be terrifying. No, you compromise, you take out the trash, you care for the house because you are already in a committed household.
The actions are a grateful response to the relationship that already exists.
Not the currency used to purchase the relationship in the first place.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The covenant is simply the form that grace takes in human history. It is a relationship ordered by God's initial rescue.
Okay, but looking at the text provided in our sources, I feel like I have to play devil's advocate here for a second.
Go for it.
Right after that beautiful, unconditional eagle's wings imagery, the text introduces a massive conditionality.
If.
Yes, the if. God says, now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession.
Right.
So, if the grace is entirely unearned and the rescue has already happened, why is there an if? Doesn't that conditionality just immediately contradict the idea of unearned grace?
It sounds contradictory to our modern ears, definitely, because we tend to think of grace as this blank check with zero relational expectations.
Right, like no strings attached whatsoever.
But historically, we have to understand what a covenant actually was in the ancient Near East. The Sinai covenant is modeled very closely on something called a suzerain vassal treaty.
Okay, a suzerain vassal treaty. Break that down for us.
So these were political treaties between a massive conquering king, that's the suzerain, and a smaller, weaker nation, which is the vassal.
So God is adopting a totally recognizable political format from that time period to explain the relationship.
Precisely. It was a cultural language they already understood. And in a suzerain vassal treaty, the document always began with a historical prologue.
Kind of like setting the stage.
Yeah. The great king would list all the benevolent things he'd already done for the weaker nation, like, I protected you from this invading army, I gave you grain during the drought.
Okay, so establishing his track record.
Exactly. And the laws that followed weren't arbitrary tests to earn his favor. They were the terms of continuing in that benevolent relationship.
Because a real relationship actually requires mutual participation.
Right. The if in Exodus 19 isn't God threatened to send them back to the brickyards of Egypt if they mess up.
It's about the reality of what it means to live out the identity of a treasured possession.
Meaning, you can't be a treasured possession of a holy God while still acting like a brutal Egyptian taskmaster.
Ah, I see. You can't carry the oppression of Egypt into the new relationship. You have to leave that behind.
Exactly. And this brings us to the specific identity he gives them. A kingdom of priests and a holy nation.
Which, on the surface, I mean, that sounds like a very exclusive VIP club.
It does sound a bit elitist at first glance.
Yeah, it sounds like God is saying, you guys are my favorites, you get the inside track, and everyone else on Earth is just out in the cold.
But reading deeper into the source material, we learn that a priest in the ancient world wasn't a private consumer of divine favor.
No, a priest's fundamental function is mediation.
Right. A priest stands between the divine and the rest of humanity.
So by calling the entire nation a kingdom of priests, God is saying their holiness isn't for bragging rights.
It is deeply missional.
Missional. The nation of Israel was meant to be a priesthood for the rest of the globe.
They were supposed to mediate the knowledge, the justice, and the character of the one true God to all the surrounding nations.
Nations that were just trapped in the chaotic, capricious worship of ancient pantheons.
Right. They were blessed with this covenant so that they could be a blessing, which traces all the way back to the original promise God made to Abraham in Genesis.
Okay, so if this relationship is established by prior grace, and if the ultimate goal is this outward-facing, missional calling to show the world who God is,
Right.
then you, listening to this, are probably wondering what the actual terms of this relationship look like on the ground.
Like, practically speaking.
Yeah. How does a nation of former slaves actually live this out? Which brings us to the most famous and perhaps most heavily misunderstood part of our source material. Exodus 20.
The Decalogue. The Ten Commandments.
The Big Ten. And we really have to look at the preface to the Ten Commandments because it reinforces that suzerain-vassal treaty structure you just mentioned.
Right. The very first sentence spoken in Exodus 20 isn't a command at all.
It's the historical prologue. It's
Yeah.
a statement of identity. God says, I am the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery.
He is grounding the law in past redemption, not future earning.
It's God establishing his credentials. He's basically saying, remember who is talking to you, and remember the massive rescue operation I just pulled off for you.
And only after establishing that theological frame do we get the actual commandments, which the source divides into two distinct tables.
Right. Table 1 and Table 2.
So Table 1 governs Israel's vertical relation to God. That includes having no other gods, no making of carved idols, no taking the Lord's name in vain, and remembering the Sabbath day to keep it holy.
And then Table 2 governs the horizontal life, right? How do you live before your neighbor?
Exactly. Honoring your parents and the prohibitions against murder, adultery, stealing, bearing false witness, and coveting.
Now, I think a modern audience looks at a list of thou shalt nots and just sees an archaic prison of behavioral control.
Oh, definitely. Just a list of buzzkills.
Right. But looking at the sociological context provided in our sources, these aren't just arbitrary hoops God set up just to see who could jump the highest.
The author explicitly calls them a revelation of the moral contours of covenant life.
What does that mean in practice, though?
Well, to understand the architectural purpose of these laws,
Yeah.
we really have to look at the psychological and sociological state of the Israelites who are receiving them.
Okay, so where is their headspace at?
Think about it. They have been slaves in Egypt for 400 years.
400 years? That's generations.
Multiple generations have lived and died under the whip. The only socioeconomic system they know is Pharaoh's system.
And Pharaoh's system is pure, unadulterated utilitarianism.
Exactly. Produce, produce, produce. Your entire human value is based on your daily output of bricks.
Wow. So if you get sick and stop making bricks, you are beaten.
And if you get old and stop making bricks, you were simply discarded.
Man. So when God issues the Sabbath command in Table 1, you will stop working 1 day a week, and so will your servants and even your livestock. That is not a religious burden.
Not at all. For a traumatized slave population, that is a radical anti-Pharaoh declaration of human dignity.
It is God literally legislating rest.
He is telling them, you are no longer cogs in a machine. You are human beings made in my image. Your value is not tied to your economic output.
That is profound. The law is actively liberating them from the internalized slavery they carried out of Egypt.
What's fascinating here is that crucial shift in perspective. The law diagnoses the sinner by showing us where our instincts are broken, like that instinct to overwork ourselves and others.
Right.
But it also serves as a guide for what love actually looks like in a functioning society.
Yeah, if you look at Table 2, it's essentially the manufacturer's handbook for human flourishing.
It really is.
Human beings simply thrive when they live in truth about authority, which is honoring parents, truth about life, which is not murdering, truth about intimacy, not committing adultery, and truth about property, not stealing.
Because without those truths, society just implodes.
It seems to me that if I tell my neighbor I love you, but I'm simultaneously stealing his property and lying about him in court, my definition of love is completely meaningless.
Yeah, the commandments put necessary flesh and bone on the abstract concept of love. It makes love actionable.
You know, the biblical authors often write beautiful, sweeping poetry about how much they love the law.
Right, like in the Psalms.
Yeah. And to a modern secular mindset, writing a song about how much you love rules sounds clinically
It
insane.
sounds like Stockholm Syndrome.
Exactly. But if you understand the law as the protective guardrails that keep society from collapsing back into the brutality of Egypt, then of course you love it.
It is the architecture of neighbor love.
I really want you, the listener, to just pause and reflect on how profound that shift is. Think about how often we view moral constraints, especially religious ones, as punitive systems.
We see them as things designed by a cosmic killjoy to ruin our fun or limit our self-expression.
But what if they're actually the trellis that allows the vine of human community to grow upward instead of rotting in the mud?
It completely changes how you view a boundary. It's not a cage, it's a load-bearing wall.
A load-bearing wall. That's a great way to put it. And, you know, building an architecture that's substantial requires a very serious commitment.
You don't just casually opt into something like that.
Right. A nation doesn't just nod at a constitution like that and say, sounds good, we'll try our best. They formalize it. They ratify it.
Which brings us to the dramatic events of Exodus 24, the ratification of this covenant.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the way this agreement is sealed and how quickly it is shattered, it reveals a terrifying fragility in the human condition.
It really does. In Exodus 24, Moses reads this book of the covenant to the people.
And they enthusiastically respond in unison. They say, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do, and we will be obedient.
It is a moment of supreme and honestly tragic overconfidence.
They have no idea what they're agreeing to, do they?
They have no idea how deep their own brokenness runs.
So to seal the agreement, Moses performs a ritual that is incredibly visceral.
Yeah, it's very intense.
Very. He takes the blood of sacrificed animals, throws half of it against the altar representing God, and then literally throws the other half of the blood on the people,
Declaring, "Behold the blood of the covenant."
We have to unpack the cultural mechanic of blood ratification in the ancient world, because otherwise this just seems like a scene from a horror movie to a modern listener.
Oh, totally. Getting splashed with blood sounds horrifying. But in ancient covenant ceremonies, walking between severed animal parts or being sprinkled with sacrificial blood was a self-maledictory oath.
A self-maledictory oath, meaning calling down a curse on yourself.
Exactly. By participating in this blood ritual, the Israelites are essentially saying, may what happened to these animals happen to us if we break the terms of this covenant.
Wow.
It signifies the ultimate life and death seriousness of this relationship. God is not casual about holiness, and human sin is not a trivial misstep.
The covenant is life-giving, but it carries the weight of ultimate accountability.
But immediately following this intense, bloody oath, we get one of the most astonishing and beautiful moments of grace in the entire Old Testament.
Yes. Moses, Aaron, and 70 of the elders of Israel actually ascend the mountain.
The text says they see God and they eat and drink.
It is the ultimate picture of the theological goal of the Exodus, which is communion.
It's a dinner party on the edge of eternity.
The juxtaposition is just staggering to me. We have this terrifying, holy God, a God who is just manifested as thunder, lightning, and fire, and yet he provides a mediated way for the fragile leaders of his people to simply sit down and have a fellowship meal in his presence without being destroyed.
It proves that the end game of God's holiness isn't isolation. The end game is fellowship.
But of course, that mountaintop high crashes spectacularly.
Oh yeah, it plummets.
Almost immediately, we turn to Exodus 32 and the absolute tragedy of the golden calf.
The narrative contrast could not be sharper. Moses goes further up the mountain to receive the stone tablets of the law, and he is gone for 40 days.
40 days is a long time when you're camped in the desert.
It is. And down below, the people experience a trauma response. Their mediator has disappeared. They get anxious. They feel abandoned in a hostile wilderness.
So they go to Aaron and they demand, make us gods who shall go before us.
They take the gold jewelry they plundered from Egypt, melt it down, and fashion a golden calf.
And they don't just make it as a piece of art, they actually worship it, saying, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt.
It is a breathtaking level of betrayal.
I mean, the ink isn't even dry on the covenant they just sealed with blood. And they are already violently breaking the very first and second commandments.
Yeah.
No other gods, no carved idols.
The cultural context here is vital, though. They didn't just pick a calf out of thin air.
Right. Why a calf?
In Egypt, they were surrounded by the worship of the Apis bull, which was a symbol of strength, fertility, and agricultural power.
Oh, okay.
When they panic, they regress to the familiar. The author of our source draws a brilliant theological parallel here. He says the golden calf is Eden repeated.
Eat and repeat it. How so?
It is humanity demanding a visible, manageable, domesticated substitute deity. They don't want the terrifying, invisible god of the mountain who speaks out of the fire and demands comprehensive moral holiness.
Right.
They want a god they can see, a god they made with their own hands, a god they can control and manipulate.
But I have to push back on the raw psychology of this, or at least explore the cognitive dissonance.
Yeah, it's baffling.
Because these people just lived through the 10 plagues. They just walked through the Red Sea while water stood up like walls on either side of them.
They just heard the audible voice of God thundering from Sinai.
Exactly. How is it psychologically possible for the human mind to pivot to idolatry that fast? To look at a piece of melted jewelry they just poured out of a mold yesterday and genuinely say, yes, this inanimate object is what defeated the Egyptian empire.
It makes no sense.
It seems completely beyond irrational.
It is entirely irrational, but it reveals a core theological truth about the human heart that the text is really trying to expose. Proximity to supernatural power does not equal internal transformation.
Say that again.
Proximity to supernatural power does not equal internal transformation. You can see the Red Sea part. You can eat miraculous manna from heaven every single morning. You can stand at the foot of a trembling mountain, and your heart can still remain fundamentally unchanged.
Because the human heart is fragile.
It is fragile, easily terrified, and incredibly prone to self-deception. When we are scared, we crave control far more than we crave truth. And the golden calf was something they could control.
Wow. Proximity to holy things does not guarantee transformed affection. That is a heavy, heavy reality.
And because the human heart is that prone to betrayal, it introduces the absolute non-negotiable necessity of mediation.
Because without a mediator standing in the gap, a perfectly holy God and a persistently sinful people just cannot share the same space.
Exactly. The burning purity of the holiness would consume the corruption of the sin. When they build the calf, God threatens to destroy the nation and start over with Moses.
But Moses steps into his role as mediator.
He intercedes. He pleads with God, not based on Israel's goodness, but reminding God of his own promises to Abraham.
And God relents. In Exodus 34, he reveals his character to Moses in a way that echoes throughout the rest of biblical history. He declares himself as merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness.
The covenant survives, not because Israel is capable of keeping it, but because God is faithful to his own character. He absorbs the betrayal.
But this massive failure at the base of the mountain, it proves something crucial for the rest of the biblical story.
Right, it proves that external rules, even perfect ones delivered by God himself, are insufficient to fix the human condition.
The problem wasn't that the 10 Commandments were flawed. The problem was the recipient.
Yes, the law can act as a mirror to show you the dirt on your face, but a mirror cannot hand you a washcloth.
That's a great metaphor. It can tell you what to do, but it cannot give you the internal power to actually do it.
And this realization forces a massive shift in how the covenant is communicated to the next generation, which is where the book of Deuteronomy comes in.
Let's talk about Deuteronomy, because it's a whole different vibe.
It really is.
Yeah.
Deuteronomy is essentially a massive pastoral sermon that Moses delivers to the second generation of Israelites.
Because the first generation, the ones who made the golden calf and consistently rebelled in the wilderness, they've passed away.
Right. Now, before this new generation crosses the Jordan River to enter the Promised Land, Moses has to renew the Sinai covenant with them.
But he doesn't just recite the laws, right? He interprets them.
Exactly. He drives the external rules inward to the level of human motivation.
This is where we get Deuteronomy 6.5, one of the most famous verses in all of Scripture, which Jesus later calls the greatest commandment. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your might.
Notice the intense emphasis on the internal architecture there. Heart, soul, might. Moses is pleading with them to understand that external behavioral conformity is simply not enough.
The law must be internalized.
Covenant failure is fundamentally heart failure. If your heart does not genuinely love God, your hands will eventually build a golden calf.
Yeah.
It's just a matter of time and pressure.
The source outlines a really beautiful concept here. It says the covenant at Sinai was both a gift and a test.
A gift and a test.
Yeah. The law was a supreme gift of truth. It showed them exactly how the universe is wired for human flourishing. But Israel's tragic overconfidence, their immediate failure, turned it into a test that exposed their absolute need for a deeper inner redemption.
Right.
It's like a world-class doctor handing a patient a mathematically perfect diet and exercise plan.
Okay, I like this.
The plan itself is flawless, right? It's a gift. It tells the patient exactly how to achieve optimal health. But the patient's inability to stick to the plan for more than 3 days doesn't mean the doctor's plan is broken.
No, the failure reveals the depth of the patient's underlying illness.
Exactly. It reveals their addiction, their lack of willpower, their internal resistance to discipline. The flawless plan is the very instrument that exposes how sick the patient actually is.
Which raises the central tension of the entire Old Testament narrative. This raises an important question. How can a perfectly holy doctor live in the same house with a deeply sick, persistently rebellious patient without the doctor's standard of health destroying the patient?
And the answer Sinai provides is the institution of the priesthood and the sacrificial system. There has to be a buffer.
The elaborate system of sacrifices, the tabernacle, the role of the high priest, all of these were established as mechanisms of mediation.
The blood of the animal sacrifices acted as a substitute.
Right, functionally covering the sins of the people so that God's holy presence could remain in the center of the camp without breaking out and consuming them.
The mediation bridges the impossible lethal gap between divine purity and human fragility.
So if Sinai diagnosed a terminal condition in the human heart that external laws couldn't cure, we have to look at how this diagnosis plays out across the entire story.
Right, because Sinai is clearly not just a localized historical event that happened to one nomadic tribe in a desert 3 millennia ago.
Not at all. It's a lens for understanding the entire human condition.
And our source material provides this incredible visual framework that traces this covenant architecture through 12 distinct stages of biblical history. Let's walk through this timeline and really examine the theological causality at each stage.
Let's do it. The timeline begins before the physical universe even exists, in eternity.
Eternity.
The author makes a crucial point here. The covenant at Sinai isn't God scrambling to come up with an emergency backup plan because things went sideways in Egypt.
It wasn't Plan B.
Exactly. The desire of God to have a chosen people and to dwell among them was an eternal purpose.
Which leads directly into the second stage, creation. And the source draws a brilliant, often overlooked parallel here. Sinai profoundly echoes the original creation order found in Genesis.
This is one of my favorite parts.
Think about it. When God creates the cosmos, how does he do it? He speaks, he makes distinctions between light and dark, he sets boundaries for the oceans, and he establishes a rhythm of work and rest with the first Sabbath.
And at Sinai, God uses that exact same methodology: speech, boundaries, and Sabbath. He uses them to recreate a people.
The Sabbath command doesn't just look backward to the Exodus. It anchors the law all the way back to the fabric of Genesis 1.
It demonstrates that redeemed human life is meant to re-enter God's original creational design.
But historically, between creation and Sinai, we have the third stage, the fall.
Right, the rebellion in Eden.
Human rebellion introduced chaos, fractured relationships, and death. And Sinai confronts the fall at every conceivable level.
Every commandment against idolatry, murder, adultery, and theft is a direct legislative rebuke of the chaos introduced by human autonomy in Eden.
So we move from the fall to the covenant stage, where the promises made to Abraham begin to take institutional shape.
Which is followed by redemption, which we discussed heavily. Salvation from Egypt leading directly to the mountain.
Right. Christ doesn't just save us from wrath. He saves us into a framework of discipleship.
Which establishes the kingdom phase. Israel enters the promised land not merely as a free confederation of tribes, but as a theocracy.
The Sinai Law serves as their national constitution.
But the timeline notes a vital tension here. The seeds of the next stage, exile, were explicitly planted at Sinai.
Yeah, Deuteronomy contains these terrifyingly specific warnings. Moses tells them, if you persistently break this covenant, if you pursue the gods of the surrounding nations, the land itself will vomit you out.
And that is exactly what happens centuries later when the Babylonian Empire conquers Jerusalem, destroys the temple, and drags the Israelites into exile.
But the author of our source makes a profound theological point regarding causality here. Exile was not an interruption of the covenant story.
No, it was not God losing control to the Babylonians.
Exile was covenant discipline. By sending them into exile, God was actually keeping the terms of the treaty they had agreed to.
The judgment was proof of the relationship.
Which then sparks the hope of the restoration stage.
Right, because the later prophets, men like Jeremiah and Ezekiel, they sit in the rubble of the Babylonian exile. They look back at the failure of the Sinai covenant, and they realize what Moses realized in Deuteronomy.
The external law wasn't enough to secure obedience?
So they start prophesying about a new covenant, a covenant where God will take the moral law of Sinai and supernaturally write it directly onto the human heart.
They promise the giving of a new spirit that will finally provide the internal power to obey.
Which brings the timeline to its most critical pivot point, the Messiah.
The Messiah.
Yeah.
And the source material explicitly warns the reader that if you read the Sinai narrative and stop your theological reflection at Moses, you have completely failed to see the mountain's true eschatological destination.
Jesus of Nazareth enters the narrative as the true final mediator. And the gospel writers construct their narratives to explicitly present Jesus as the new Moses.
The parallels are undeniable once you see them. I mean, think about Matthew's gospel. Where does Jesus deliver his most famous foundational teaching, the Sermon on the Mount?
He ascends a mountain, sits down, and authoritatively interprets the moral law.
He doesn't abolish the law of Sinai. He intensifies it to the level of the heart. He says, "You have heard it said, 'Do not murder.' But I tell you, anyone who is angry with his brother is subject to judgment."
He is speaking with the unmediated authority of the lawgiver himself.
We see it again at the Transfiguration. Jesus is on a mountain, shining with unborrowed divine glory, and who physically appears next to him.
Moses and Elijah, the physical embodiments of the law and the prophets, pointing to Jesus as their ultimate fulfillment.
And the most stunning parallel happens at the Last Supper. Jesus is sitting with his disciples in the upper room. He takes the cup of wine, and what does he say? "This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins."
He's directly quoting Exodus 24, where Moses threw the blood of the animals on the people.
But here, Jesus isn't offering the blood of a goat. He is providing his own blood.
He is acting as both the high priest mediating the covenant and the sacrifice itself.
It's brilliant. The source explicitly warns that stopping at Moses is a failure. Jesus is the covenant keeper where Israel historically failed.
He perfectly obeyed the law, and on the cross, he bore the maledictory curse of their disobedience.
So what does this all mean? This Christological fulfillment explains the next phase of the timeline. The church.
Because Jesus perfectly fulfilled the terms of the Sinai covenant, the modern global church now inherits the vocation that was originally given to Israel.
The Apostle Peter writes to early Christian communities, composed of both Jews and Gentiles, and he intentionally lifts the exact language from Exodus 19. He calls the church a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation.
Which fundamentally redefines modern Christianity.
It means faith isn't just a private, internal, highly individualized spirituality where it's just me and Jesus in my heart.
No, faith is incorporation into a massive historical covenant community. It is inherently public. It is corporate.
And being part of that corporate body carries intense accountability, which brings us to the judgment phase.
The lesson of Sinai is that covenant privilege does not grant you a free pass to live however you want. It actually increases your moral responsibility.
The closer you are brought to the divine fire, the more you have to respect its holiness.
Which all drives toward the ultimate final stage of the timeline, the new creation.
The source summarizes this perfectly. It says, "The final state of humanity is not lawless freedom, but perfected communion in righteousness."
We finally get back to the unhindered fellowship of the Garden of Eden. But it has matured into a city.
It is humanity living in the immediate, unmediated presence of God without fear, because the mediation of Christ is complete.
And the human heart has finally been fully internally transformed to love what God loves.
It is a breathtaking, sweeping narrative arc that connects Genesis to Revelation. But, as awe-inspiring as that grand 12-stage architecture is, we really need to bring these massive historical concepts down to your daily reality.
Yeah, we have to ground it, because people misunderstand Sinai constantly.
They really do. And those theological misunderstandings warp how they live, how they vote, and how they interact with their communities today.
Let's tackle those. Our source lists several common modern traps in Section 6. The first one we've touched on, the trap of legalism versus grace.
Right. This is the error of thinking Sinai is a manual for earning your salvation by keeping a strict list of rules, rather than seeing it as a set of gracious instructions for a people who have already been redeemed.
The second common misunderstanding is treating the Old Testament law as entirely obsolete.
Like, oh, that's just the old stuff. It doesn't matter anymore.
Exactly. Some modern believers assume that because we are under the new covenant of grace, the Old Testament law has zero relevance to their lives.
But while believers are not under the law as a covenant of condemnation, the Decalogue still reveals the unchanging moral character of God.
It still shapes our moral imagination. If you discard the Ten Commandments as ancient relics, you lose the foundational objective definitions of what justice and neighbor love actually look like in practice.
But the third misunderstanding is where I think the friction really grinds against the modern mind.
Oh, this one is huge.
The source calls it identity without obedience. I think where this really clashes with modern life is in how we construct our sense of self.
Right, because the dominant cultural narrative today is that you must look inward to find out who you are.
Yes, you are taught to excavate your deepest psychological desires, bring them to the surface, and demand that the external world validate them.
That is how you build an authentic identity in the 21st century.
But Sinai completely inverts that. Sinai says you look upward. God says, you are my treasured possession, therefore you are. Your identity is handed to you from the outside.
It's given, not created.
Exactly. How does a modern person reconcile that total clash of worldviews?
It is a profound clash, and honestly, reconciliation might not be possible without surrendering the core premise of one view to the other.
Really? One has to give.
Yeah. The biblical view posits that a self-created identity is ultimately exhausting and incredibly fragile.
Exhausting because you have to maintain it.
Exactly. If you create yourself, you have to constantly sustain yourself. You have to constantly perform to maintain the identity you've curated, and you are entirely dependent on this shifting validation of society.
Which we know is a terrible foundation.
But the Sinai view is that belonging to God's covenant is what shapes your identity. You are declared a chosen, loved, treasured possession first, before you've done anything to earn it.
And your obedience to the law is simply the natural expression of that deeply secure identity.
You don't obey the rules to figure out who you are. You obey because you already know who you are, and more importantly, whose you are.
That reframes everything about daily life. I think where this also creates massive friction is in our modern concept of leadership.
Oh, leadership is a big one.
We have this expectation today that leaders, whether in business, politics, or the church, they need to be these charismatic, visionary innovators.
We expect them to invent new paradigms and rely on their magnetic personalities to drive people forward.
But looking at Moses as the archetype of leadership at Sinai, his job description was entirely derivative.
He didn't go up the mountain and brainstorm a new vision statement for Israel.
No. His only job was to humbly receive what God said and faithfully pass it on to the people.
Sinai dictates that faithful leadership is actually obedient reception.
Obedient reception.
It's not about inventive self-expression or building a personal brand. It's about standing in the gap, enduring the complaints of the people, and faithfully transmitting the truth of God without altering it to make it more popular.
And when the people inevitably fail, as they did with the golden calf, Moses doesn't get cynical.
He doesn't resign and discuss.
He intercedes for them. He pleads for mercy. That requires a level of theological resilience that personality-driven leadership simply cannot sustain.
Absolutely. And what about worship? Because the golden calf incident seems like the ultimate warning against consumer-driven religion.
Today, we often evaluate worship based on how it makes us feel. Was the music right? Was the atmosphere engaging? Did it cater to my emotional preferences?
But the golden calf was essentially the Israelites demanding a worship experience that catered to their anxieties.
They wanted a God they could see and manage.
Sinai argues that worship isn't about unconstrained human creativity or putting on a massive spectacle. Worship is about meeting a holy God on his prescribed terms.
He sets the parameters of how he is to be approached because he is holy and we are not.
If we prioritize accessibility over holiness or entertainment over reverence, we aren't innovating. We're basically just pouring a modern golden calf. We are worshiping a projection of our own desires.
That is exactly the warning of Exodus 32. And finally, there is a deeply pastoral application here regarding how we process suffering and patience in our own lives.
I'm glad you brought this up.
Yes, I want to speak directly to the listener here, to you. If you are currently in a season of life that feels like an endless wilderness.
It can feel so isolating.
Maybe you've had your Exodus moment, you've been saved from something terrible, you got out of a toxic relationship, you broke an addiction, you escaped a dead-end path, you are out of Egypt.
But you haven't reached the promised land yet?
No. You are just wandering in the dry, confusing desert in between, and it feels like a massive, pointless delay. Our source teaches that this wilderness is not a mistake.
No, it is the precise location where covenant identity is forged. The waiting is not wasted.
It is a crucial reminder of God's methodology. Sometimes God rescues you before he fully instructs you.
And the barren space between the initial rescue and the final realization of the promise is where the hard work happens.
It's where you actually learn how to live as a free person. I mean, the geographical escape from Egypt took a single night,
But
right?
getting the slave mentality out of the Israelites took 40 years in the wilderness.
It requires deep, uncomfortable patience. Well, we have covered a monumental amount of historical and theological ground today.
We really have, from top to bottom.
We started with an oppressed people making bricks in Egypt, covered in mud and despair, viewed only as economic units.
And we end with a holy nation standing at the foot of a trembling mountain, bound by an eternal covenant of love to the creator of the universe.
We've seen that God's salvation is never just a rescue from suffering. It is a purposeful rescue into fellowship.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the grand takeaway is that true grace trains us.
Gratitude for being carried on eagle's wings must eventually mature into willing obedience to the Ten Commandments.
We do not obey to be saved. We obey because we are saved. And that salvation is meant to structurally transform us so that we begin to reflect the character of the God who saved us.
And as we wrap up this deep dive into Sinai, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final lingering thought. It builds on everything we've read in these sources, but takes it one step further into how you view the constraints in your own life.
A shift in perspective.
Yes. Think back to that ultimate end goal we discussed on the timeline, the new creation, where God dwells directly with humanity in perfected communion.
Right, the final destination.
We so often think of rules, laws, and moral boundaries as things that inherently create distance between people. We view them as walls that keep us apart.
We view them as restrictive.
But what if the story of Sinai proves the exact opposite? What if God's rigorous demand for holiness, his precise, unbending laws, and his absolute insistence on a blood mediator weren't there to keep humanity away, but were actually the only possible architectural framework that could safely bring a fractured, sinful, highly combustible humanity incredibly intimately close to a holy fire without them burning up?
When you view the law through the lens of that ultimate communion, it changes everything about how we view obedience.
Next time you feel weighed down by the rules of your life or your faith, next time you bristle against a moral constraint that tells you no, ask yourself, are these rules keeping me trapped in a cage, or are they the very architecture preparing me to stand safely in the immediate presence of the divine?
It really puts the rules into a beautiful perspective.
It really does. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.